Hello and welcome to Approaches, Freud and Psychoanalysis. In today's session we're going to look at the psychodynamic approach, the role of the unconscious, the structure of personality, the id, the ego and superego, which are the structure of personality, and the defense mechanisms. We're going to leave psychosexual stages to next lesson because this is a huge amount of information to take in one go. So let's talk a little bit about Freud then. He was an Austrian neurologist. He died in 1939. That date's interesting. What happened in 1939? Keep it in your head. It'll become relevant later. And he was the founder of psychoanalysis. His interests were the role of the unconscious, dream analysis, and his main contributions were therapy and the talking cure. He did in some ways take psychology and popular culture into a less scientific direction, especially with his dream analysis. We know that a lot of what he was talking about regarding the purpose of dreaming was actually completely wrong. We now know that it's more to do with memory consolidation than repression and things like that. But anyway, probably one of the most, definitely one of the most influential psychologists of all time. History and context. Freud was a medical doctor and was interested in a variety of psychosomatic disorders, specifically patients who couldn't move their legs despite there being nothing physically wrong with them. Freud used hypnosis to treat them and found to some degree of success. Now this is quite an incredible idea. Psychosomatic is the idea that something psychological could have a physical expression. Now we know this to an extent. We know anxiety causes sweating and stuff like that, and it's a psychological event causing a physical, but we're talking about paralysis. Anyway, he used hypnosis. This started to shape his ideas about how the unconscious interplays with the physical body, the mind, behavior, and consciousness. A bit more on the history then. He also found some evidence of unconscious processes in the development of phobias. Now, you know that Freud relied heavily on case studies, and he investigated a case labelled Anna O, who suffered a phobia of drinking water, and under hypnosis it turns out that she once witnessed a dog being allowed to drink from her owner's glass. Now here's why Freud started to think that these talking cures could work, because when Anna O recalled this memory, her phobia immediately disappeared. Well, not immediately, but her phobia disappeared. Now that suggests that hypnosis could be used to actually dredge up these memories that have been repressed, and that by exposing the memories, this will somehow cure the patient. So this led to Freud developing the concept of this dynamic unconscious, so it's not just a unitary system. There are different parts of ebbing and vying underneath. Freud was also interested in dreams, as we mentioned, and he published The Interpretation of Dreams. I have a copy if anyone's interested in looking at it. In fairness, it is mostly gibberish, but there is a germ of logic to his approach, certainly. Remember, a case study, our research methods is a detailed investigation of a single individual or small group, blah, 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 blah. In this case, he did follow up with many of these patients. Lots of qualitative and quantitative data could be gathered. You can give them tests and interviews and all sorts of stuff like that. Allows researchers to study things that would otherwise be difficult. You couldn't, for example, establish an experiment, instill in one person a phobia and the other not, and then treat, or both phobias, treat them with different methods. It wouldn't be ethical. Remember, Anna O's case can't be replicated. You go to Freud and you've got a phobia of dogs, which is called cynophobia. If you got a phobia of dogs, what's he going to do? Let's say he drudges up the memory. It may not work for you. Everyone's different. Researcher can lose objectivity. Freud certainly did. He became enamored with the method and to some extent lost his objectivity. And he actually superimposed a lot of his own issues, which we'll talk about later, onto his patients. For example, and we'll talk about this in psychosexual development, Freud had uncomfortable sexual feelings towards his own mum when he was a kid. And to explain these, you can imagine that developing an all-encompassing theory in which we all have those is probably quite appealing. Difficult to generalise because so few people are studied. So, let's move on. History and context. I asked you what happened in 1939. And of course you know what happened in 1939. World War II broke out. Now Freud was Jewish. And he was a German. I mean, technically Austrian, but so was Hitler. When the Nazis began to rise to power in the 30s, one of the most Philistinic practices, I made that word up, but you know what Philistine means. They used to burn books. It's a crime up there that's just unparalleled. People who burn books are the lowest of the low. Anyway, Freud's books were prominent texts to be burned, as were texts written by Einstein as well. Anyway, Freud heard of this and quipped. My favourite quote, one of my favourite quotes from Freud, he's got a better one actually. What progress we are making in the Middle Ages, they would have burned me alive. Now they are content with burning my books. He eventually managed to escape Germany, occupied Austria. And there is a good book on this called The Escape of Sigmund Freud. I think it's by David Cohen. And it's an interesting look at how they actually managed to get him out. He moved to London and he lived with some of his family that he managed to smuggle out. But what's interesting is his older sisters actually died in Nazi concentration camps because they couldn't get the visas that would allow them to travel out. So we very, very nearly had no Freud and no psychoanalysis. When he arrived, he moved in very famous circles. He was something of a celebrity and eventually died in 1939 in an act of euthanasia. He had cancer, mouth cancer, I think it was of the jaw, and probably the result of smoking so many cigars. But he eventually took his own life as a result to end the pain. One more thing worth noting about Freud is that he was an ardent atheist, and he wrote an excellent book called The Future of Illusion, and it's really difficult to read, but it is a seminal text for the young, budding rationalist mind. So let's get into his theory of personality. According to Freud, there are three constructs or three elements to our personality. We have the id, the ego, and the superego. Now the id we have from birth, and it represents our instinctive drives. The pleasure principle, you know, we're hungry, we want to eat. We're thirsty, we want to drink. You get the idea. Anyway, the ego though, let's just skip to the superego. On the other hand, so if the id is our inner caveman, the superego is our priest. And that's our moral principle, and it decides what's right and wrong, and it's all about delayed gratification. It's all about extreme morality, and the ego attempts to balance these two. Otherwise, you just wouldn't be able to operate. And it works on the principle that you can't always get what you want, and yet you should sometimes try. So it balances these two elements quite well. This, pay special attention to this diagram. We'll look at in a bit more detail actually now. So this is the iceberg diagram, which is pretty famous now, that represents Freud's depiction of your personality. So this bit on the surface is the bit that we're actually conscious of. What you're thinking right now listening to this presentation, assuming you are conscious, is this bit. But for Freud, the bulk of our personality is in the preconscious and the unconscious, and we don't have direct access to either of these. But luckily, we can access them using hypnosis, free association, and dream analysis, which we'll talk about later. Remember I said the id is the drives. You may not even be aware it's driving you, but this is an incredibly powerful and evolved drive. And the superego, you're not constantly conscious of slapping down your own desires. There's just like this unconscious struggle. So let's talk briefly about these methods that Freud proposed. We have hypnosis. Hypnosis is the induction of a state of consciousness in which a person is highly responsive to suggestion and direction. I've actually been hypnotized myself, and it's an unusual feeling, but it's not as they often portray it in the movies. No one can tell you to go, like Darren Brown, go and shoot someone. It doesn't work like that. No one can tell you to strip off all your clothes and run around. Not unless you want to. There is an element where at any point, at least for me anyway, at any point I could have stopped it. And there were clear sort of lines, a bit like in a dream. You know, if a dream gets too scary, you can often wake yourself up. This is what this feels like, but it's a bit more lucid. Anyway, Freud believed that it could be used in therapy to uncover repressed memories. And remember, with Anna O, just recovering the memory resulted in resolution of the phobia. Free association. We're going to carry out some free association in class next time, but essentially we're talking about letting the mind run free without constraint. So it's prompting you with a word and asking you to come up with the first thing that pops into your head. So if I say, trauma, what pops up? If I say crow, what pops in? And this is supposed to tell us something about your unconscious. We have to trick it almost to reveal itself. We might do it with images. We might flash up an image of, a flamingo or something and just get your instant reaction. And there's the Rorschach test, which we'll look at next time. And then we get into the defense mechanisms. So these are probably the most valuable contribution, along with Freud's theory of personality, that psychoanalysis has really bequeathed us, because they actually feel like they have a kernel of truth to them. So take repression, for example. It is quite common, or at least commonly found, that people with significantly traumatic memories in childhood, for example, often do not recall those memories. I will tell you a story in class. I'm not going to record it because it's quite personal, but I have an example of this very thing happening. So you can imagine that repression feels like a real thing. Something so harmful has happened to you, so traumatic, that you've repressed it into your subconscious to protect yourself from having to confront it. Denial, this is probably a more common one. You have no doubt been in denial at some point, perhaps during your revision stage. Painful information is just blatantly ignored. I'm not even going to think about it. I'm just going to go find some Pokemon or something. And displacement, an emotion triggered by one event, individual, is redirected elsewhere. You will have experienced displacement or seen it. Sometimes teachers displace. They're angry at something, they get in the class, a student says something stupid or behaves a little silly, and normally they'd be tolerant, but no, today they're going to come down like a ton of bricks. That's the essence of displacement. The original trigger is gone, and we redirect it at someone or somewhere else. So that's all we're going to cover in today's Freud session. The key evaluation points of Freud are that actually, by emphasizing the role of the unconscious, we are finally recognizing a massive driver behind our behavior. It's all very well us talking about behaviorism as though we're environmentally determined, or talking about Wundt and his introspection, that we're aware of what's going on, but actually so much of what we do and say is completely unconscious. Just think of the number of lies you tell every day. Not intentionally. You don't wake up, I hope, in the morning saying, do you know I'm going to be the biggest, fattest liar ever today? You don't do it. But you probably tell hundreds of lies, scores of lies every day, minor things, and they're largely unconscious. We don't even, we're not even aware we're doing it. Inspired stage development theory. So we'll talk about this next time. But the idea that children develop through stages rather than in a linear and balanced fashion. His reliance on case studies is a mixed blessing. In some ways they were good because you got this wealth of information, the longitudinal approach and all that stuff. The downside is generalizability, replicability and things like that. So more unscientific, which links to the next point. How do you go about falsifying something Freud says? So you walk in, you lie on his couch, or actually you sat on his couch. You sat on his couch, and you say, I'm having a dream. And he says, I know what that is. That's because you're incredibly stressed at work, and it's coming out in your unconscious. And you say, no, I love my job. Look how much you're repressing, how much you hate your job. You're even pretending to love it. You can't falsify this stuff. There's no clear prediction that Freud can make that you can then say, all right, let's test it. If it's wrong, we'll throw the theory out. Popper would not approve. It may lack historical validity. I mean, one of the issues that Freud gets lambasted because he come up with some very interesting interpretations of people's behavior that were sexual in nature. And he emerges from a time, the post-Victorian Edwardian culture, which was very obsessed about sex. And therefore, this probably speaks to some of Freud's anxieties and decisions to actually interpret it through that prism of sexual repression. Today, we're much more at ease with ourselves. If Freud was about today, probably would have put less emphasis on sexual repression. He might have put more emphasis on gender identity or something like that. So in some ways, all theories are products of their time. And culture bias. One of the big limitations of this is lie down on the couch and tell me how you feel, and that will make you better. Well, we don't all think like that, not culturally, not even on an individual level. I'll share another story with you in class, but just from a cultural point of view, I grew up in a very masculine culture, even though I grew up in a house dominated by women, actually, but the men around me in my life were always very masculine, and it was the norm was to not talk about your problems, to suppress, not repress, but suppress your problems, and be there for your family and other people who needed you. This idea that you sit on the couch and just tell them what your problems is a cultural bias approach. A lot of Freud's patients were middle class Viennese women. Well, maybe that's a suitable method of therapy for middle class Viennese women turn the century. but maybe not, for example, in China, where in China, there's a strong emphasis on not burdening others with your problems. So those are our key evaluation points. Remember, each of these you're going to have to turn into PE, and we've got a few tasks now that I'm going to ask you to complete for next lesson, one of which will be to do that. Right. Oh, one more thing. Ethics. There is an ethical issue. I mean, in some ways, discussing people's traumatic experiences are good. They can lead to personal growth and so forth. In some ways, though, there are some limitations. I mean, psychotherapy is not prescribed on the NHS. There is some psychotherapy, but not psychoanalysis. And it is very rarely prescribed. 9 times out of 10, if you go to your doctor with depression, he'll give you a pill. And the reason why is because it's quite time-consuming and incredibly costly. But it also is linked to how motivated you are for the therapy to be a success. And those who are more motivated may get more out of it in the long term. Is it ethical drudging up repressed memories? If you're walking around your life and you're quite happy not knowing that you suffered this childhood trauma, well, should a psychotherapist start prodding and prying? Fisher and Greenberg review the literature on psychoanalytic theory, and they argue that you can't reject the theory as a package. There are elements that you can say, okay, the interpretation's wrong, there's bits that aren't very useful. But actually some can be reshaped and repurposed into the modern world. And there is a link to some extent between psychotherapy and humanism, which we'll look at later, and there's a bit of cognitive in there, and even a bit of evolution, actually, quite a bit of evolution. Right, let's get on and do something. Just a quick reminder, it's been a long summer. Perhaps you'll come to this for the first time. Point, evidence, explanation. Point is our statement or claim. Freud was highly influential because of X. Then the evidence. Back it up, and your explanation is why it matters. I've got no problem with you in the early part of this year using stock phrases to help you structure these, especially for the explanation. You can't really go wrong with the phrase, this matters because whatever comes after must be the reason why this matters. It may not be written well, but it should be there. So let's get stuck into the exam questions. Question 1. Remember, you have to bring these with you to class next time so we can go through it. Question 1 is an AO2 exam scenario. So, Ella and Georgia, two complete random names, are at the club when Ella finds two £10 notes on the floor. Ella and Georgia take one each. Ella spends it on drink, and the next day boasts about it to her friends. Georgia feels guilty about it and gives it to charity. How would the psychodynamic approach explain the differences between the two girls? 3 marks. Okay, so remember, you've got to link this, elements from the STEM, to what we've covered today. Obviously, we talk about Freud's theory of personality. We're not talking about repression or anything like that. So you've just got to create those links. Remember, bring the answer with you to the next lesson. We're going to use it in an activity. Right, question 2. Give one strength and one weakness of the psychodynamic approach. You cannot use case studies because I've already done that one for you. Remember, answers must be PE in structure, and there are 2 marks per PEE. Have a go. Bring it to class. We're going to go through it in one of the activities. Right. An optional scenario for you. I'm not going to read it out. You can pause it and have a look. But this is an interesting question and might require a little more research on your part, or at least more information from the guide notes than's present in this presentation. So I think that is more or less everything to cover for today. I'm just going to throw these slides in where I can, though obviously this represents more work for me, so I'm not saying they'll always be there, but it's worth noting that Bachelor of Science degrees have fallen out of favour. You can't get a psychoanalysis or psychodynamic theory Bachelor of Science or Bachelor of Arts even. You'll cover it in sociology and psychology and stuff like that, but there's no straight degree in it on its own. However, there are still some postgraduate courses that do psychoanalytic studies. So you can do a PhD at UCL, Kingston has an MA in psychoanalysis, and the University of Essex has got a postgraduate degree in psychoanalysis. If you love Freud, and I have to admit, I never used to, he's grown on me a lot, it's worth considering, maybe a career in psychoanalysis. So that's everything. Thank you for listening. If you've got any questions, write them on your guide notes or email me. See you next time. Bye.
Audio Jungle.